The story of the Romanovs is a tragedy born of supreme privilege and profound historical delusion. For 3 centuries, they were the architects and masters of an empire so vast it defied comprehension. In 1913, the celebration of the Romanov tercentenary was their zenith. Moscow and St. Petersburg exploded in celebration. Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra, dressed in magnificent 17th century costumes, presided over an impossible spectacle. They were not merely monarchs, they were the last true autocrats, operating under the inviolable, unquestioned doctrine of divine right. This sense of predestination, that their power was bestowed by God, formed the psychological barrier that prevented them from seeing the tectonic shifts occurring in the modern world. Their opulence was not just display, it was a desperate, subconscious denial of the brewing social and political storm. Nicholas II was a man supremely unsuited to the role of an absolute ruler. Kindly, devoted to his family, and possessing an almost boyish simplicity, he lacked the ruthless pragmatism and commanding presence necessary to control an empire so complex and volatile as Russia. His tragedy began early. At his coronation in 1896, the infamous Khudinka field disaster saw over 1,400 people trampled to death in a panic over free food. His decision to attend a lavish ball that evening, rather than rush to the mourning public, permanently cemented his image as a remote, uncaring czar. He constantly underestimated the power of the revolutionary movements and consistently resisted any meaningful steps toward constitutional reform, viewing the very concept of a parliament, Duma, as an insult to his sacred duty. The political vulnerability of the regime was overshadowed by a catastrophic personal flaw: the health of their only son, Tsarevich Alexei. After 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, the birth of an heir was initially a relief, but the joy was quickly replaced by terror. Alexei suffered from hemophilia B, inherited from his mother, Alexandra, who was a granddaughter of Britain's Queen Victoria, earning it the moniker the Royal Disease. This condition meant that the slightest bump could lead to agonizing, life-threatening internal bleeding. The necessity of concealing this fact from the public, who needed a symbol of strength in the heir, isolated the family entirely. Alexandra became obsessed with protecting the boy, living in constant, suffocating fear. This fear created a spiritual and emotional vacuum in the heart of the Alexander Palace, a void ready to be filled by the inexplicable.
Into this environment of fear and desperation walked Grigory Rasputin, the Siberian starets, holy man. Rasputin was uneducated, crude, but possessed a magnetic, almost hypnotic charisma. His piercing eyes and compelling presence made him an unforgettable figure. When the most educated physicians and healers in Europe failed to alleviate Alexei's suffering during his terrible bleeding crises, Rasputin succeeded. He would sit by the boy, speaking calmly, praying, and often the bleeding would slow and stop. Modern analysis suggests his success lay not in magic, but in calming the boy and forbidding the use of aspirin, which thins the blood. To the deeply religious and emotionally distraught Tsarina Alexandra, Rasputin was nothing short of a miracle, a messenger sent by God to save her son and, by extension, the dynasty. Alexandra's trust in Rasputin was absolute, blinding her to the political poison he represented. Being German-born, she was already viewed with suspicion by the Russian aristocracy and the public. Her unshakable conviction in the autocracy, coupled with her reliance on a drunken, scandalous peasant for political counsel, was explosive. She convinced Nicholas that any criticism of Rasputin was an attack on the Tsar's own authority and on Alexei's survival. Rasputin's presence in the capital became a full-blown national scandal. Reports of his debauched behavior, his drinking, sexual promiscuity, and overt political meddling filled the gossip columns. The nobility, who saw the monk as a direct threat to their own influence and Russia's stability, felt a paralyzing rage. They saw the throne being contaminated by a low-born manipulator. The perception, more damaging than the reality, was that while the vast, hungry empire waited for sound government, the royal family was preoccupied with a religious charlatan. As political stability crumbled around them, the court was consumed by one subject, the mad monk. This deep internal fracturing made the entire empire brittle, ready to shatter at the first major external shock. That shock was World War I.
When World War I erupted in the summer of 1914, it was initially met with a brief wave of patriotic unity. Nicholas II saw it as a spiritual war against the Germanic enemy and a chance to restore his popularity. However, Russia's colossal size masked a colossal weakness. The country was industrially backward, its infrastructure primitive, and its military bureaucracy riddled with corruption and inefficiency. The Russian army mobilized millions of men, but they were often sent to the front without adequate rifles, sometimes only one gun for every 3 soldiers, warm clothing, or proper boots. The sheer scale of the casualties was staggering, numbering in the millions by 1915. Against the frantic, unified pleas of his cabinet ministers, his Duma, and his most experienced generals, Nicholas II made the single most fatal decision of his reign in September 1915. He assumed personal command of the army at the front. His generals, notably Grand Duke Nicholas, begged him not to, knowing he lacked the strategic competence. But the Tsar, driven by a misplaced sense of imperial duty, believed his presence would inspire the troops. The opposite occurred. Nicholas's absence from Petrograd, the political capital, left Tsarina Alexandra in charge of the government. His decision meant that every subsequent catastrophic military defeat was now attributed directly to the Tsar himself, destroying the myth of the distant, divinely inspired ruler. With Nicholas at the military headquarters in Mogilev, Alexandra, entirely guided by Rasputin, effectively became Russia's despot. She saw her rule as a divine mandate to preserve autocracy until her son could rule. Using Rasputin as her spiritual guide, she began dismissing competent, experienced ministers, the last vestiges of functioning government, and replacing them with the monks' incompetent, greedy, and often ridiculous cronies. The government became a chaotic revolving door. This political sabotage, combined with Alexandra's German background, Germany was the enemy, led the public and the political elite to near certainty. The Empress was working with Rasputin to ensure Russia's defeat. This wasn't merely incompetence, it was treason in the eyes of the people. By late 1916, both the monarchy and the war effort were fatally compromised by the petticoat rule of Alexandra and the shadow rule of Rasputin.
The nobility, watching the accelerating collapse of the empire and convinced that Rasputin was the source of the rot, concluded that the only way to save the Tsar was to remove the Tsarina's influence. A desperate, high-stakes conspiracy was organized, led by Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia, and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's cousin. They represented the highest echelons of society uniting against the crown's eminence gris. The assassination took place in the dead of night on December 29, 1916, at Yusupov's palace. The plan was melodramatic: lure Rasputin to a basement, feed him cyanide-laced cakes and Madeira wine, and dispose of the body. The events that followed cemented Rasputin's terrifying legend. He devoured the cakes and drank the wine, seemingly unaffected. Yusupov, trembling, finally pulled out a revolver and shot the monk in the chest. Rasputin collapsed, and the conspirators left him for dead. The prince later returned to examine the body, only for Rasputin to suddenly lurch back to life, his eyes wide and wild, attacking Yusupov in a desperate struggle before staggering into the courtyard. The conspirators, terrified by this seemingly supernatural resilience, shot him multiple times again, beat him, and finally wrapped him in a rug, tied him with chains, and threw him through a hole in the ice into the frigid Neva River. The autopsy later confirmed he died not from the poison or the bullets, but from drowning. The conspirators believed they were acting as saviors of the monarchy. Instead, the murder only added to the atmosphere of bizarre chaos and decadence. Alexandra was devastated, viewing the murder as an attack on her son and the last pillar of their security. She never forgave the conspirators. The assassination was not the solution. It was merely a sensational punctuation mark on the monarchy's obituary. It demonstrated for all to see that the highest members of the ruling class were willing to resort to violence against the Tsar's closest allies. The Romanov regime was now utterly exposed, having lost the support of the military, the government, and the aristocracy.
The true catalyst for the collapse was not a political conspiracy, but starvation and freezing cold. By the winter of 1916-1917, the economic infrastructure had utterly broken down. The railways were prioritized for military supplies, meaning Petrograd had almost no fuel or food. In February 1917, mass demonstrations erupted, primarily led by hungry women textile workers demanding bread and peace. The protests quickly spiraled into a general strike that paralyzed the capital. This was the moment of truth for the Tsar. He was isolated at the military headquarters, miles away from the chaos, and completely failed to grasp the scale of the crisis. He ordered the troops stationed in Petrograd to suppress the disorder. This was the pivotal, irreversible moment. The troops, many of them young reservists and recruits who were sick of the war and sympathetic to the workers, refused to fire on the crowds. Instead, they mutinied. Entire regiments joined the demonstrators, turning the military against the regime. When the soldiers, the final, most vital pillar of autocracy, joined the revolution, the Romanov dynasty was instantly finished. The Duma, seeing the complete collapse of state authority, formed a provisional government to take control. In March 1917, Nicholas II, traveling back from the front, found his train stopped at Pskov. He was surrounded by his generals and representatives of the Duma, who delivered the inescapable truth that every major military commander, every political leader, and every remaining general agreed that the only way to save Russia from complete anarchy and perhaps save the war effort was for the Tsar to abdicate. Nicholas resisted, clinging to his belief in divine right. However, faced with the unified voice of his military and the reality that his own troops would not fight for him, he yielded. On March 15, 1917, in a small provincial train carriage, he signed the documents, first for himself and then, tragically, for his son Alexei, thereby ending the 304-year Romanov rule. He was driven by a belief that he was making the ultimate sacrifice to save his country, hoping for a comfortable exile in England. The world, however, had moved on beyond mercy.
The newly formed provisional government initially kept the Romanov family under house arrest at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo. Life became one of profound, pathetic boredom. The family clung to routine, gardening, reading, and tutoring the children, maintaining a facade of imperial dignity. They wrote letters, still hoping that their relatives across Europe, particularly King George V of Great Britain, who was Nicholas's cousin, would intervene and grant them safe passage to exile. George V, fearing the political turmoil the arrival of the detested Tsarina Alexandra would cause in wartime Britain, shamefully and disastrously refused. The Romanovs were isolated and abandoned. As the political situation deteriorated in the capital, the provisional government decided the Romanovs were a liability too close to the seat of power. In August 1917, the family was sent on a long, arduous journey to Tobolsk, deep in Siberia. Here, they were housed in the former governor's mansion. They were still treated with a degree of deference, allowing the family to live in a temporary bubble of relative comfort and hope. In October 1917, the comfortable exile was violently shattered. Vladimir Lenin's radical Bolsheviks seized power in a coup, establishing the Soviet regime. For Lenin,
The Romanovs were not just relics of the past, they were the absolute living symbol of the class oppression and tyranny that his revolution was sworn to destroy. The new regime had no room for mercy or sentimentality. The family was abruptly moved again in the spring of 1918, beginning a grueling journey that saw them separated and reunited under terrible conditions. Their destination, Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. They were confined to the Ipatiev house, a confiscated merchant's mansion that the local Ural Soviet, a hotbed of Bolshevik ruthlessness, had ominously christened the House of Special Purpose. At the Ipatiev house, the imprisonment became a form of psychological torture. The windows were painted over to prevent them from seeing or being seen. The guards were crude, low-ranking factory workers and miners, entirely lacking in respect for the former rulers. They sang offensive songs, drew vulgar graffiti on the walls, and stole their personal possessions. The family's dignity was systematically stripped away, preparing them for total dehumanization. The Romanovs maintained a desperate piety. Alexandra, driven by a desire to preserve the family's assets against an uncertain future, instructed her daughters, particularly Olga and Tatiana, to sew massive amounts of jewelry, diamonds, emeralds, and rubies, into the lining of their corsets and foundation garments. She believed these jewels were their last hope for funding an escape or a life abroad. Unbeknownst to her, she was constructing the last bizarre piece of their historical narrative. By July 1918, the anti-Bolshevik White Army was closing in on Yekaterinburg. The local Ural Soviet realized that the Romanovs were an immense liability. If the Tsar was rescued, he could become the single most powerful symbol for the counter-revolution, potentially crippling the Soviet cause. The final order was relayed from Moscow, approved by Lenin. The Romanovs had to be eliminated. In the early morning hours of July 17, 1918, at 1:30 a.m., the execution squad, led by the grim Yakov Yurovsky, was assembled. The family, Nicholas, Alexandra, the 4 Grand Duchesses, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, the Tsarevich Alexei, Dr. Botkin, and 3 loyal servants, were woken and led to a small, cold, half-cellar room in the basement. Yurovsky read the terse death sentence. The Ural Soviet Executive Committee has resolved to execute you. Nicholas, shielding his son, managed to utter only the single word, "What?" The command to fire was given, and the small room erupted in a deafening, chaotic frenzy of smoke, screams, and gunfire. The execution was not clean. The bullets ricocheted everywhere. The assassins were horrified to discover that the Grand Duchesses were not dead. The diamonds and jewels sewn into their corsets acted as crude, makeshift bulletproof vests, deflecting the initial volleys. The executioners were forced to use bayonets and fire at point-blank range to finally silence the remaining victims. The entire imperial line and their last loyal attendants
had been systematically and brutally annihilated, their bodies riddled with over 70 bullet and bayonet wounds. The Romanov dynasty was no more.
The Bolsheviks' objective was total annihilation and erasure. The bodies were transported to the remote Koptyaki forest, where Yurovsky and his men systematically mutilated them, using acid and fire, before burying them in a mass grave near the mine site of Ganina Yama. The public was initially told only that Nicholas had been executed. This secrecy was the primary engine that drove the greatest royal mystery of the 20th century, the legend of Anastasia. For decades, the idea that one Grand Duchess, the spirited youngest daughter, had miraculously escaped captured the world's imagination. The story of Anna Anderson, a woman who claimed to be the survivor, became a global cause célèbre, an epic of survival against all odds that resonated powerfully with American romanticism. The Romanov tragedy is directly woven into the history of the United States. The execution was the final bloody act that cemented the Bolsheviks' power, leading to the creation of the Soviet Union. For the next 70 years, the Soviet Union was the geopolitical adversary that defined America's foreign policy, its military spending, and its culture, the Red Scare. The destruction of the monarchy was the prerequisite for the rise of the totalitarian state that built the gulags and erected the Iron Curtain. When Americans view the Romanovs, they see a profound historical warning: the danger of a government so completely detached, so blind to the suffering of its people, that the resulting revolutionary backlash is total and merciless. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 finally allowed the truth to emerge. The first mass grave near Yekaterinburg was exhumed, and DNA testing confirmed the identities of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters. However, 2 bodies were still missing: Tsarevich Alexei and one of the Grand Duchesses, initially believed to be Anastasia. The mystery persisted. In 2007, the remaining 2 bodies were found in a separate grave nearby. Subsequent definitive DNA testing proved the absolute final truth: all 7 members of the Romanov family perished in that basement. Anna Anderson was conclusively identified as a Polish factory worker named Franziska Szankowska. The mystery was closed. The romantic legend was definitively shattered by science. In 1998, the remains of the family were formally laid to rest in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, providing a final solemn closure to the most dramatic and devastating royal saga of the modern era. The Romanovs' fall was not just the end of a family. It was the violent, chaotic birth of the 20th century's defining ideological conflict. They went from ruling 1/6 of the globe to becoming forensic evidence in a Siberian forest. Their story is the ultimate cautionary tale of power, privilege, and the brutal, unforgiving nature of history. Click the link below to access the declassified files on the execution order and the official DNA reports that finally put the Anastasia legend to rest. Like this video to help us continue uncovering the hidden corners of history. And subscribe to our channel for the next chapter in this series, The Architects of the Soviet State, Lenin, Stalin, and the American Response.